Thank you very much, Donnie. Good evening, everyone. I don't see everyone, so I can't say it's good to see you, but I know you're there and I appreciate you taking the time to stop by. As was mentioned, we're going to be doing a series of presentations that are based on 15 years of mystery histories that I've written for the Monocle. A mystery history is a story about the town, a historical story, that may not be on the historical map, so to speak. It's not something generally you're going to find on a metal sign along the road, a marker, but they're always intriguing, they're always in fun. Now, tonight's theme of the three is Poolesville during the Civil War, and it'll be stories especially about our connection to President Abraham Lincoln. And the last story I tell you happens to be my favorite mystery history of all time. So to begin with, we'll talk a little bit about the town and our role in the Civil War and our special connection to Abraham Lincoln. Now, to intrigue you a little bit, I can assure you that the name Poolesville was a name that happened to come across Abraham Lincoln's mind most likely every single day of the war. Our town, believe it or not, was probably one of the most famous towns in the world for a very simple reason. We had a telegraph in Poolesville. As you know, in those days during the Civil War, without all the communication things we have today, the news of the war came through Signal Corps with flags, riders on horseback, and telegraph. Most of the battles were outside of our area. We had very few. Well, we had a skirmish in Barnesville, of course. We had a raid on the Presbyterian Church, but we really never had a battle. However, because the telegraph was here, the stories of the war came in. So the news from the battles would be signaled across Virginia and the other states until it reached Sugarloaf Mountain. And at Sugarloaf Mountain, they would take the message and flag corps or signal corps with flags down to Poolesville to a signal corps that was based approximately where the town's thrift shop is today. And then it would be telegraphed into Poolesville. And it's there the news. So what made Poolesville is every day, the date line read, the date, July 12th, 1862. And the next thing said, Poolesville, Maryland. And then they told what happened in the war. So all of these news stories, if you research the Civil War, you will find in towns and newspapers, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all over the world, when they were talking about the Civil War, it often was datelined Poolesville, Maryland. And so you can see that inadvertently we became a famous little town. So that's our first connection. But our connection to Abraham Lincoln goes even deeper than that. The man took a special interest in all the news from the war and the telegraphs that came in. If you saw the movie Lincoln, you recall that he got so concerned about the war, he didn't even wait in the White House for news. He would go down to the telegraph office and sit there and wait. And when I tell you this first story, he got some profound news that shook him badly from a telegram from Poolesville. So the first aspect is why Poolesville it was famous during the war and how we're connected to Abraham Lincoln. The next story is about a man by the name of Colonel Edward Baker. This gentleman is, or was, Abraham Lincoln's best friend in life. Now, how close was he? Close enough that he named his second son Edward after him. Now, Edward, as a young boy, died in 1850, just at 4 years old. It was a tragic, tragic situation for the Lincolns. But interesting thing, and it tells you a lot about the character of Abraham Lincoln, Colonel Baker and Abe Lincoln became acquainted as political adversaries in campaigns, and very early in their political career. And Lincoln got beat by Baker. And still, it turned out that Baker became his best friend. So it's kind of an interesting aspect that Colonel Baker, I found intriguing because at the time, he was one of America's greatest orators. People considered him maybe the best public speaker of all the political leaders in America. In fact, I have a fun theory. I don't want you to take it too seriously, but I really believe had the man not been born in England, he would have been vice president for Abraham Lincoln. And then hence this gentleman would have become president when Lincoln was shot. But because he was from England, he was not selected as the vice president. And he was a kind of man that would win a campaign in Illinois, as did eventually Abe. He moved out to California and got elected political office out there. And here's how popular he was. When Oregon became a state, senators were selected by the legislatures. And they wrote a letter to Edward Baker. Dear sir, if you moved to Oregon, we would be honored to make you our senator. That's how profound and powerful a speaker he was. And he took him up on it, and he moved to Oregon. And interesting enough, he was only a senator for maybe 7 or 8 months before the war broke out. He was also known as the Gray Eagle, and he was a hero from the American Indian Wars at the time. And he moved to Oregon, and he became the senator. And then the war broke out. And because he was a hero during 1812, he joined up. He became an active officer in the military. Many of you probably know his difficult or hard aspect of fame came from the fact he became the only member, the sitting member of Congress, the House of Representatives or the Senate, to die fighting in the Civil War. And the battle, how that happened is very intriguing too. The day before he left for active duty, he, Abe, and Mary Todd, and Willie Lincoln, and the boys were on the White House lawn, sitting on the White House, literally laying on the White House, talking and reminiscing and sharing stories and friendship, because they were about to part. And Lincoln knew his great friend was leaving for Poolesville to join the cause. And being a flowery man, he made a really beautiful speech and gave flowers to Mary Todd, and he left on horseback and left and came to Poolesville. Well, his headquarters was the 1784 building here in town. You know where that is. That's at the corner of West Willard and Fisher, that little white brick building. Time it was a little red brick building. And he made that building his headquarters. And he got news that across the river, there were some Confederates, a small contingency of Confederates, but still a significant number. And they could, at the time, we had around 15,000 troops. Imagine that today in Poolesville, we have what, as you know, around 5,500 people. Well, back then, the population in Poolesville was closer to 15,382. The 382 actually being Poolesville. A little side note, just for fun. About that time when Poolesville had 382 people, Bethesda magazine, sorry, they're one of my clients, so I always say that by mistake, but Bethesda, Maryland had 25. So we were 10 times bigger than Bethesda at the time. And so he holed out here, and he hears about these Confederates across the river, and his mind takes him back to July of 1861 and a terrible defeat at the First Battle of Manassas. Now, many of you probably know that was one of the greatest defeats and a shocking defeat to the Union troops, primarily because it was early in the war and nobody expected the war to last long. It was basically a joke. Recruitment and the times to sign up for, so when a soldier signed up to fight for the Union, they signed him up for 90 days. Most of them signed up because they wanted to get the uniform because it was fancy and it looked good and great time to be a soldier. Unfortunately, even though the people from Washington traveled out to Manassas in their carriages to watch the battle, it was a disaster. Thousands, and I think it's around 20 or 22,000 if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, but it's a huge number died. And after that, the news on the war went downhill. The press was hounding, bad press for a president is not something just of our times. Lincoln had a terrible press. He had enemies that hated him profusely, and the press was not kind. And he was going through a tough time, particularly because it was going badly. And already early in the war, he was learning that he couldn't really find a general to his liking. He fired a lot of people when he didn't like them, and he did it quickly. And he did these things. And Colonel Baker thinking, well, if we go across the river and rout these Confederates, which is not a big contingent, we can telegraph in tomorrow morning, the Union troops won a battle. And so he thought this would be a chance to give some good publicity to his friend Abraham Lincoln. Around 4 or 5 o'clock on October 21 of 1862, he and another 1,900 soldiers crossed the river at Conrad's Ferry and went across to what was an area called Ball's Bluff. And it was here that they figured they would encounter this benign contingency of soldiers, win a victory, and hail the great news across the world. Unfortunately, they were routed, 1,000 casualties. When they got there, the Confederates were there in strength, cannon, and these guys were pretty much caught between the cannon and the river. They were jumping off the Ball's Bluff, a bluff being a cliff. If you go over there today, it's set up pretty nice. 20 years ago, you wouldn't even know what was there, but now it's kind of a nice park and historical site. And so they were just slaughtered, and quite bodies, Union troops, bodies floated down to Washington. They were coming into Washington 2 and 3 days later. It was a disaster. And in the middle of this great battle, the Colonel Baker, who had been in many battles, decided he'd go over and fight with the troops, and he was right in the middle of it. And he was reported to have handled himself very courageously, as he always did, but he got himself killed. And his body, after the battle, it ended around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and as evening came, they brought the body back, and they put him in the building where crafts aplenty used to be. Christopher Holmes is in the one office to the right, and to the left is where the body was placed. In fact, the way it was described that evening, around 2 o'clock in the morning, because it was raining the rest of the day, finally the reinforcement troops from Rockville came in from town, and they were walking through the mud. One soldier wrote home that when we got to Poolesville, there must have been something going on in a building, because there was all this armed guard all around it. He said, I don't know, but somebody extremely important had to be in there. And of course, he was referring to the body of Edward Baker. And then the word came to Lincoln. His best friend was killed. Now, it's important to remember, not only was his best friend lying in a house in Poolesville, but the news he got came from the telegraph from Poolesville. And the way the newspaper described it is profound. It shakes me up, and I think it will too. Because it says, and I'm going to just basically read it. The telegram came, Lincoln read it, and they said, the great man just sat there for a full 5 minutes, silently, saying nothing. The president, who was unattended at the time, with bowed head and tears rolling down his furrowed cheeks, his breast heaving, left the room, almost falling on the steps as he walked out. So obviously, the story of Colonel Baker and Abraham Lincoln in Poolesville is one of the most profound stories of our time. Does anyone have any questions about what was happening in Poolesville or the story I just told? I'll take a time to take a breath and see if you're all still there. Does anyone have any questions? Go ahead. Okay, well, that makes it a little bit easier for me. You got to remember, at the time, we were a garrison town. You gotta imagine what Abraham Lincoln was going through during the Civil War, because he sits in Washington, D.C., and to the south is a Confederate capital. To his west is a river, and north is Baltimore, and Baltimore is a highly pro-South city. In fact, when Union troops came through Baltimore to fight the war, they stopped, the train stopped in Baltimore, they rioted, and the famous Baltimore riots occurred because they didn't want the troops, the Union troops, coming through Baltimore, after all, to fight the South. And to the west was the wilderness, and then, of course, Virginia and all the southern states. And so he was surrounded. So the plan was basically, we'll put 15,000 troops in Poolesville, because that's a dangerous spot for us, because just up the river is a thing called White's Ford. And many times during the year, it's so shallow there that you can actually walk across the river. And in fact, a couple of months ago, last fall, American Legion sponsored that. And we had some Boy Scout and Girl Scout, mostly Girl Scouts, join us. And we did the walk across the river. And it never came up beyond our thighs. I was surprised, although the bottom was rocky and rounded rocks, and you could easily lose your footing. But so because of that vulnerability, he put 15,000 troops in Pools. He put another 9,000 or 10,000 down in Darnestown, just about where the Harris Theater is. You'll see they have a little town Vest Pocket Park, and that commemorates the fact that they too had a garrison site there. And then further down, they had another one. And then the entire city of Washington was surrounded by about 13 different protective camps. And so the idea was, if they do attack Washington, they're going to have to go through 15,000 troops in Poolesville first, and then another 10 in Darnestown, that type of thing. So we were very, very important. And so we had 15,000 troops. Now, they didn't do a lot of fighting, and they came and they went. They didn't stay often, long. One troop, the 14th, I think, was from New Hampshire regiment, whose sergeant was a Sergeant John Sturdivant, were encamped in Poolesville. And he's someone we all know if we're familiar with some of the maps. I don't know if any of you own the historic medley map of the town that was penciled by a soldier during the Civil War who encamped here. And that map is intriguing because it draws Poolesville and the houses and the location. I'm pleased to be living on one of the houses that he actually pens, and here it is, it was here. And he sent it home to his mom and dad, which was a great breach of security, because that kind of information should never go to the South. Although I have to admit, the South probably knew as much about Poolesville as you're ever going to need, because there were so many pro-Southerners living in town. One of the great adversaries to the Union troops during the war was the 35th Cavalry Unit, Virginia Cavalry, the 35th Virginia. That was started by a local guy by the name of Elijah Veers White. You know the name. We have White's Ford and White's Ferry. And over on Westerly Road is a large home called Stony Castle. It's a nice manor mansion. Eric Spates and the family lives there now. That was his home. And he formed this Comanche group. And it was made up largely of Poolesville and Frederick boys and Montgomery County boys. They often referred to soldiers at the time as boys, so that's why I do it as well. Troop officers generally would shout commands or exhortation to their men and call them boys. Well, boys, we got to do this, or boys, we got to do that. And so the Comanches were a very famous group from the area. In fact, it's the Comanches, because they had so many friends in Pools, learned in October of 18, I'm going to skip a year here, go ahead a bit, but in 1862, in October, they learned that there was a change of garrison troops. So while we had 15,000 troops at one time, there might be 2 or 3 weeks or longer where the troop strength would be much lower because they were changing troops. In fact, John Sturdivant's group, when he left town, they set a record for the most officers killed in a single day, and Sergeant Sturdivant became Captain Sturdivant very quickly. Anyway, to get to my real point, he drew this map. And when you see the map, it's intriguing, that because first of all, north is at the bottom of the page and south is at the top. And the date's wrong. The date actually says I think it's a December 29th, 1862. And they were here in 1861. They left long before December. And so the only explanation is because it was December 29th, and so close to the new year, he wrote down the wrong year. So that's a mistake. And the maps, north-south was wrong.
That's fine.
Yeah, but the most interesting thing, if you have one of the maps, I want you to go home and look at it, and you look in the left-hand corner and you'll see little tents that depict the garrison troop tents. And that's up where, somewhere in the neighborhood of where the John Poole Middle School is there. And you'll see something scribbled at the top, but you can't read it because it's upside down. So if you take the map, turn it around and look upside down, what he has written is my house. He sent this home to Mom and Dad, and he's saying, if you come here, this is where my tent is, and he's got an arrow, and it's really cute. And it's really a great map, and the Historic Medley has them for sale. So if you want to buy some and hang it in your home, you can always go to get one from the Historic Medley. Anyway, so that's just an add-on to the story of Poolesville and everything that was going on. But it leads to an important thing, and this is my favorite story of all. In fact, if anybody has connections to Maryland Public Television, tell them they got to do this movie, even if it's just an hour movie. It's about a gentleman, a beloved gentleman by the name of Uncle Waddy Owens. And his wife's name is Polly. And these names are real. It's like right out of Central Casting, but it's true. And he was a slave, and she was a slave. And he was a beloved person. Everybody in town loved Waddy Owens, very religious. From everything we've read, it looks like he was a member of St. Peter's, because the church and the choir loft that he describes would be St. Peter's. And if it is St. Peter's, he would go to church every Sunday through the back door steps. If you go into St. Peter's today, into the old rector's office, you'll see on the wall the outline of a door that's bricked in. That used to be the stairway to the loft, so that the slaves, or the African Americans, blacks, could attend. I say it that way because some were slaves and some were free. I happen to live in a home that was owned by a free African American. And so he describes that, and he loved to sing, and everywhere he went, he sang, and he was a joy to be around. But he was lame and he was old. He was 60s. He was in his 60s and had a very bad foot because, and this is an important part of the story, because one of the ways he made his living was his wife, Polly, could make some of the best little cakes. And I'm not going to say it's a cupcake, but it probably was not a large cake, because he would take these cakes and he would put them in a wicker basket, or a woven basket, I should say, probably different, and with a lid. And he would walk amongst these troops. And remember, we have 15,000 troops here. And not only did the folks in Poolesville enjoy the cakes, but selling them troop. This is like a touch of home. The smelling of the cake, you can just imagine it. He's walking through the dirt and the mud between the tents, and he's got this basket, and he's got cakes to sell, and he's walking among the members. And one time, the Union troops released a bunch of horses, lame, swayback horses, most of them ready to die, all of them unuseful to the Union anymore in terms of battle. And old Waddy, he took one of those horses and he brought it back to life, and he nursed it back to life. And what happened, in fact, he told Polly, he says, I think we can make a genuine success of her, and we're going to call her Flying Cloud. And that happened to be named after the fastest horse that was owned by one of the man's name was Mars, Mr., an African slave's way of saying Mr. He was Mars Fenton Odd's horse. He was known as the Flying Cloud. And why he says, he actually beat Mermaid. So his old sway dying horse was what he had. Well, this man brought this horse back beautifully. He was able to build a little pull wagon, not on wheels, but that would drag behind the horse. And he could carry so many more cakes, and he could sell so many more. and life was wonderful. And he continued to enjoy life. In fact, if I can see it here, in fact, he became the soldier's favorite as he was in town. And then, in fact, he was so popular with everyone. One of his best friends was a man who wrote this story. That story I'm telling you is in detail in a newspaper account written by Edwin Higgins, very distinguished white gentleman, also a member of St. Peter's, who befriended him, and they became very close. And Edwards, the account reads as if he really wasn't a permanent resident of Poolesville, often came to Poolesville, was here a lot. And he left for a long time. And when he came back, one of the first things he did is check on his buddy, Uncle Waddy, and asked him how he's doing. And that's when he found out that life was pretty bad. He said, well, tell me what happened. He said, well, I had the horse, I brought him back, and everything was fine. And then the troops came through town on the way to Gettysburg. And they saw my beautiful horse, and they saw that U.S. brand on its rear, and they took him back. Waddy was just glad he didn't get arrested for stealing a horse. They believed him that he got it because they did it. But nevertheless, the horse was now healthy, and so now he's out of a horse, and his leg is probably more lame than ever. And he told his friend Ed Higgins, he says, you know, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is really terrible. And Ed thought about it for a while. He says, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go down to Washington and we're going to get you a horse. So he wrote the whole story up because obviously Uncle Waddy couldn't write. And he stuffed it into a big envelope and he handed it to Uncle Waddy. And he says, you take it down to Washington. Somehow, Uncle Waddy found himself outside the White House with his envelope and the note written by his friend Ed Higgins. And he turned it in to the Secretary of Staff at the front of the door. As many of you know, that's how informal it used to be. That's how you could actually approach the President of the United States. And he turned it in and he went outside and he waited. And he waited. And after a number of hours, a note came down from the great man himself. And you know what he wrote? It was a note to the Quartermaster General of the United States, ordering him to issue Uncle Waddy a brand new horse. You imagine what a great story. And so he's so thrilled now. And I'd like to find, I wanted to just share some of the stories about that. He's in, after giving the letter of introduction, but anyway, the way Waddy used to refer to the stories, he could never stop telling the story. And the way he ended it was always the same. It was, the half of it can never be told. He said, I bless the Lord. And it's really typical for that because of the reverence for Abraham Lincoln, African-American reverence for Abraham Lincoln was so profound. You know, when going back to the church story a little bit, it's interesting because I mentioned to you that the African Americans were separated from the white folks. They were upstairs and the whites were down. But that was only half the problem because those downstairs were still separated because the men and women, they didn't sit together either. The men sat on one side and the women on the other. So separation apparently was a sign of the times. And so that's the story of Uncle Waddy, who is, it happens to be my favorite mystery history. And does anyone want to ask me any stories about questions about that?
I have a question from the chat. Was Waddy related to the Owens family in Bealsville?
Now that's an interesting thing. It's hard to trace his, but you know they do have Owens Park in Bealsville, and they have, and Owens is a, it's not the largest African American name in town, but it's an important one. And yes, so you can only assume that he did, but unfortunately, records for those who were slaves are really hard to determine often. And that's why there's some records at that time. I got the church at St. Peter's registrar, and it goes all the way back to the beginning. And that's an interesting document because one of the first persons to sign it was John Poole Jr., who was, as you know, had the store in town. And John Poole himself was an interesting guy because he not only ran a trading post in town, but he was also a member of the vestry at St. Peter's. He was a lay reader, so often they would find themselves without a priest, and so John Poole would conduct the services, not a communion service, but a prayer service at St. Peter's. And just as an aside, one of the largest roles that John Poole had in town was that of being a factor. Does anyone know what a factor is or who a factor would be in his time? But now we're going all the way back to around 1793. Well, as you know, we were an agrarian society. And in fact, as you go into the trading post, John Poole trading post, you'll see all kinds of things on the walls. They were the kind of items that he sold to help the farms prosper. And it used to be, they got it out, I guess it was old, but we used to have some tobacco plants dried tobacco hanging in the corner. It's no longer there. I honestly think we should get some more back because that was a cash crop for our area. And so instead of cash and coin, they often bartered and traded. And there could be a dispute, how much tobacco should I get for this item that you're selling, type of thing. And so disputes would arise. You needed a judge, you needed someone to decide. And so that person would be called a factor. You'd go to the factor and say, okay, I think it should be this. You say that, factor it, figure it out. And that person in our town was John Poole. He was a factor. So tobacco didn't last long in the town. It depleted the soil. I always tell the young kids, remember, it's terrible for your lungs, just as it is terrible for the ground. It destroyed the land just like it destroyed your lungs. But the fact of the matter at the time, the tobacco was the crop of the day. Anyway, so I get off into my tangent. I forget where I was headed on that. But that's just an aside on the story of some mystery history of Poolesville.
I have another question from the chat, actually. Was the agricultural production of the area greatly affected by the 15,000 soldiers camping in the field?
Oh, yes. And everything about it, the barns, the fences. They would call it pillaging. We would call it stealing, we being people in Poolesville. You got to remember that anything in town they believed was theirs. A lot of fencing was lost for firewood. If you go out to the Monocacy Cemetery, you'll see a little chapel there. Well, that's in the location and it's the size and it's the same structure that you would have seen back then, but it's not the exact ones there because the Union troops tore that apart board by board for burning fuel and other wood items, especially those kind of things could be lit and fired up quickly. You could do a nice fire fast. You didn't have to wait for it to dry out and all that. And now at the time, theoretically, you were supposed to pay for anything you pillage. And although they would steal stuff and give the person a note saying, I took this and this is what it's worth and you can get paid by the government. The lawsuits on what should be paid went way beyond 1778, 1780. I mean, I've read accounts in 1780, 1778 that they're still debating. But the biggest test for anyone making a claim in Poolesville to be reimbursed for pillaged items was their loyalty to the Union, which was difficult because most weren't. And nevertheless, if they wanted to be paid, they would have to prove that they were pro-Union. before they would get paid. And so that's one of the reasons. So often you would find that one of the officers from the union would elaborate on the person who's being, I mean, the pillaging wasn't always as brutal as it sounds. I mean, sometimes they were almost apologetic, and they would take the stuff, and often the officers would write an elaborate support for the property owner as a union supporter, and he's a good guy, but I need these, I took his 200 chickens because or whatever it is. So that's the union troops. You can be sure the bread, the wheat, and any product that we were growing, they felt was theirs. And it's interesting because we are just learning now more and more the importance of logistics in military. And it's a long. I was in the Army, and there's an old saying: the Army moves on its stomach. You got to feed these guys. There's nothing more important than keeping fat. And it's said that one of the reasons that Lee chose to go into Pennsylvania after so many years of battle in Virginia was the farms were depleted. The Southerners really, they fed themselves on the road, so to speak, taking what they want locally, and that was getting thinner and thinner. And when you get up to Pennsylvania, it's a much more welcoming battlefield in the sense that there's a lot more you can pillage them. The barns are fresh, fences haven't been stolen, and the cattle and the chickens are available. So that was one of the appeals of taking the war into the North by the South in that regard. And I don't know if anyone's ever been over to White's Ford. Has anyone in the here this evening been to White's Ford and actually seen the location? Because you'll be welcome to come. American Legion will have another walk, and we'll let you know, and you'll be invited to attend sometime. And if you'd like to, it'll be during the warm weather, and it'll also be time when it's not flooding, because we have to be very careful. It's extremely dangerous. In fact, in the paper, I was a little bit reluctant to publicize it, only for fear that, oh boy, I hope people don't start, oh, let's do this, because so often during the seasons of the year, you can't do it, and it's extremely dangerous. And so I worried about, some people doing it at the wrong time, but that's an important thing.
Hey, this is Steve Sparenborg. I was just at White's Ford last Saturday with John Wolves, the group that he was leading.
Yep.
As we explored White's Ford Fort.
Yeah.
So he took us down to the actual location of the ford.
Great. I was going to mention John, and he's doing a number of walks for you, the Poolesville Senior Group. And John is a man who has given his heart and soul to the C&O Canal for many years. He's you talk about titles and names. He was a walker. That's a volunteer who walks a certain section of the canal and helps keep it clean and watches for trees down or damages and reports back. And that's one of the ways that management of the canal can keep track. And he has taken it to heart, and he's learned so much of the history. And I was just so thrilled when he came aboard as one of the writers. He writes a column we decided to call In Your Own Backyard, to talk about the things you can do. I wanted to be able to write more than just about the canal itself. So we expanded it from, it wasn't going to be C&O Canal, but so he said in your own back, and it's enabled him to write a lot more history than just the canal. He had one just recently about a gentleman, I think his name was Rollabard, and he was unusual because he was a man from Poolesville who actually fought for the North. Yeah, so I encourage you to join John on any of those walks.
Yeah, Poolesville Seniors actually promoted the pop-up walk with John Wolf.
Yeah,
so if you keep an eye on our Facebook and our emails that we send out every week, we'll let you know if we repeat the White Ford Fort walk, and we'll also be doing some other interesting locations. So definitely keep an eye out for that.
We have one more connection that I didn't mention. I don't know if Susan Talia is here tonight. Susan, are you attending this evening? Do you see a Susan Talia is attending? I can't see who's attending or the name or anything else.
I
Well,
can.
apparently she's not, because she's not speaking up. Susan's related. She's related to Abraham Lincoln. So that was just one more aside to all the, but Abraham Lincoln thing. The 1785 building, by the way, in town was not built in 1785. A lot of people know it as the 1785 building. And it's not. John Poole Trading Post is still the earliest trading commercial building in town. And 1780, it was actually built after that period of time, but it was an important building in Poolesville. Over by the thrift shop, you can see, if you've done that, an Eagle Scout a few years ago, I wish I could remember his name because he deserved to be recognized by name, did an Eagle Scout project and really brought that whole area back to life. There was a lot of headstones that were still left over, but there was a number of soldiers buried there. And often when they were buried temporarily. I mean, they got killed in a battle, or they killed in the area, and they would get buried there temporarily until they could move the body back home. Even Edward Baker, sitting in the house there in Crafts of Plenty, he was eventually sent home to Oregon to be buried, or maybe it might have been California, but it wasn't. He was not buried in Arlington. He wasn't buried in Poolesville. Another fun story is that President LBJ and Senator Morse were over. President Truman and a general. Now I got it right. And I'm not his name. I'm not going to try to say the name right. I'll look it up, and if anyone wants to know, I'll be happy to tell you. Toured the Battle of Ball's Bluff, and when they heard of Edward Baker, they decided to come across the ferry to Poolesville, because they were certain he was buried in Poolesville, and they were going to visit his grave. And they came across the ferry, Truman, and they came into town and only discovered that no, Baker wasn't buried here, but his body was brought here and put in state in that building until they could move him and take him home. What is it? Oh, I got an answer. What it was? Will Martin, is that right, Dennis? Dennis, are you telling me the Eagle Scout name was?
Yeah, Will Martin was the Eagle Scout. That was his project.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for coming up with that, because it's a wonderful project that he did. It was a lot of work, and it's one of the great. There's so many things, folks. I'm telling you right now that Poolesville could have a booming economy just based on local tourism. The town needs to get behind it. They need to think of what they can do. You know, Locals Restaurant is doing a thing where they're trying to bring an atmosphere to bring more people in the weekends. But I'm telling you, there's such a fabulous walking tour of Poolesville that can be given when you tell all these different stories about different places. And in the thrift shop, for example, one of the pastors was buried in the wall in the back, and his headstone was back in there. So there's, I guess that could become a ghost story. I don't know, but there's a lot of mystery histories for Poolesville, and those are the little tidbits of history that are so intriguing. I had a wonderful history teacher in high school who ended every class, and I'll never forget Mr. Kelly, because at the end of the day, the last thing he would give us is, and he would he'd wet his lip. There you go. Now for your tidbits of history. And believe it or not, the kids actually sat there probably every day, just can't wait to hear Mr. Kelly's tidbit of history. And we have a lot of them here in Poolesville.
I have a couple questions from the
Yes.
chat for you. Do you know why the 1985 building got that name?
Well, it's not for the year. I think it has to do with the lot it's on. A lot of the property in town, most of it was named. It's very common back then that property lots were given names. Up the street from me, I'm just behind, behind what was Watershed is a Peter Forrest home, and so they had a name. My property was actually called Wits End, but if you go back in record, you'll see in the lots and in the surveys there was names, and also, so as I recall, 1785 refers only to a number based on identifying the lot. And that's what I understand. But it was not built in 1785. That's the most clear thing I can share with you.
What building is that today?
Okay, it's a corner. Well, you know, most people tonight will know the Blue Hearth building, the Dr. Thomas Poole building. Across the street from that, on the same side of the road, is a little white building. It's now Robert, no. The lawyer's name. Anyway, it's a law office now. Roger Hayden. Oh boy, I'm glad I remembered. Roger killed me if I couldn't remember his name. Roger Hayden's office is there. And so that's the best way. And it's still a little white building. If you go to Dr. Pike's office, or even Bassett's, you see this. No, it's in Bassett's on the wall. There's a picture taken. The position it's in, the shot was taken, was as if you were standing in the front door of the old town hall, the old bank building, looking west. And you can see that building. You can see just a little part of the Thomas Hall home. And then the home before it, where Rivas is known as Frederick Poole. So these are all relatives and sons of John Poole, who became lawyers and successful in those homes, and they built those homes. And you can see that house in the picture there. But it was Edward Baker's headquarters. You know, it's interesting because it was so early in the war. Another aside to that is it became a major scandal. The loss, and Congress, General Stone, who was the leading general in this region at the time, ended up in prison for 9 months before he finally was released and acquitted. But a lot of blame was going around what happened at Ball's Bluff. It shouldn't have happened. And unfortunately, Colonel Baker was a large part of that tragedy. But you go over there, you can see some graves there. It's a national cemetery, but it's not the biggest national cemetery you've been. There's not nearly as many graves as you're used to seeing.
Another question from the chat is, what was the relationship between the soldiers and the Poolesville residents like? Did they harass the residents?
I don't know. I've not personally read of any incidents of social or cultural interaction that would be of any nature, positive or negative. But there had to have been times when it wasn't. I mean, you get 15,000 troops encamped here, and largely with nothing to do. So there must have been some troubled times. They certainly were troubled times because the town was filled with Southern sympathizers. That would be a start. I often joke when I'm talking about the artifacts that you find at John Poole House that were dug up by Jim Poole, and they're on display. And if Jim found a lot of artifacts, and we were lucky, but I would say, well, you know, when you get 15,000 young men together for a period of time with nothing to do, the one thing they're going to do is make a mess and leave a lot of things behind. And so we were lucky, but no battle occurred here. But it's certainly a lot of bullets because they had to take target practice. I won't say where the site is because it's off limits. They don't want you there, but it was a target range, not too far from where the high school is. And a lot of the bullet, if you find a bullet that's spent in Pools, it was almost assuredly target practice. I did a mystery history not too long ago of a rifle that was dug up recently in the area, and the area right at the end of the barrel where a person would be, his eye would be right to the scoping area site, blew up, and obviously would have killed the owner. And they think he probably either double jammed the musket with 2 rounds, or he did it too tightly and it blew up. But John Strong, who's a town engineer, turned it over to the NRA for me, and they came back with a really interesting history of that rifle. It was actually originally made and housed up in Harper's Ferry, and somehow found its way to Poolesville.
That's very cool. Do we have any more questions? Feel free to unmute right now and ask them if you have any, or turn on your camera and unmute and ask. And you can also send them in the chat, either directly to me if you want it to just be private, or just in the general chat.
Hey, Randy, this is Steve.
I'm not taking any questions from you, Steve.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Question.
Yeah.
Where in the town did the 15,000 troops actually bivouac? Were they
Over by the middle school.
over by the middle school?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing was,
I would suspect that the homes that were built there would have had a lot of artifacts, or maybe even still, but go ahead.
yeah. So the other thing was, as far as getting food and everything, they just took from the people in the town and around the farms and everything.
Primarily, I mean, well, let's be real about what they ate.
Right.
Okay, they didn't eat a lot. Okay? A loaf of bread was, if they each of these encampments would have a bakery.
Right.
And it could make a lot of bread. And if you got a loaf of bread, that probably is your take for the day. And occasionally you would be meat. And yes, they did some honey, and of course they would do some fishing. But you can't feed 15,000 men like that. And to the degree that the quartermaster capability of the Southern troops could do so, I'm sure they tried to, there was a pretty extensive railroad system that existed. So
Right.
it wasn't impossible to move volume, but getting the volume was there. So I'm not saying it was all local pillage, but it was a huge part of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if Abraham Lincoln came anywhere near Poolesville on his way to or from Gettysburg after the.
I mean, there's absolutely no record of that I've seen, to tell you the truth. Yeah, I think going north from the south, 355 would have been a more primary road up the Frederick area and going north. We're quite a bit west of that because of that. Those people, I mean, Robert E. Lee came through here after some skirmishes. Drew Early did. They crossed over at White's Ferry. And again, they would know about White's Ferry because there were so many Southern troops that would have been from the area, Montgomery County or Frederick County. And they would have known about the opportunity. The river bends there pretty severely, causing the ability to have a very shallow river. And so they would have known that. But in answer to your question, boy, that would be wonderful to find, but I don't have any. I will say there's a home down near Berrysville Road that I was in a number of years ago. And it was going to be renovated, historically renovated. And part of the talk on the day that I was there to visit and raise awareness of it was that the gentleman was an important business person from Washington who owned this home. And Lincoln did come out and stay a night at his house. It seems that George Washington probably slept in more homes than Lincoln. There's more Washington slept here kind of story. Over here on going toward Frederick, just past the Woodstock equestrian thing on the right, is property that was surveyed and owned by George Washington. He did a lot of survey here. Washington probably came through town for sure with his survey work and the fact that he did that kind of work. His dream was always to build a canal, but the rapids was always a major obstacle. But he was a major proponent originally of building a canal. So no, I don't know about Lincoln. He missed out, but he knew about the town. He had to hear that town day after day. His best friend was killed and came here. A slave came here I just would have loved to have seen his face when he read this letter, this story. Ed Higgins wrote it up. And if you read his newspaper account, it's really interesting because it's written in the verbiage of the time. Very eloquent and very sometimes difficult to follow because of their sentence structure and everything at the time. But he was obviously a highly educated man who could write a letter. And I'm sure he told a great story. And I just love the thought of him looking at that saying, you know what, this guy's going to get a horse back. And he probably, with all the tragedy of the war, there probably was not a lot of opportunity for pleasure in Lincoln's life. And that had to be one of them.
Well, it's 7:59, so just before we run out of time, I'd like to make sure to say thank you, Randy, so much for presenting tonight. You're an amazing storyteller, and it was so much fun listening
Oh, good. Well,
to
thank you. I'm
all
glad
your
you-
stories brought to life. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
everybody.
having Randy.
We
I
can't
hope-
wait for the next one.
We're going to have a few more. We're going to do one in April, I believe, and I'm going to talk about all the wonderful festivals. You know, Poolesville Day and the celebrations and festivals did not start with Poolesville Day. We've been doing it for 25 years, but we have a wonderful, unique history of how we celebrate it as a community. And so in April, I'm going to share a number of those stories with you about how we did so. And you'll be amazed. One of those parties they threw, folks, lasted 3 days. So you didn't buy a ticket for one event, you bought a 3-day ticket. So we'll talk about that.